Princess Arya stood at the highest tower of the Valorian palace and watched the human transport ship descend through the purple clouds of her homeworld, and the ship was small and battered compared to the elegant vessels of her people, but something about its determined approach made her heart beat faster, and beside her the dragon Ember sensed her anxiety and pressed her warm, scaled body against Arya's leg in comfort. The council had debated for 7 solar cycles whether to allow humans onto Valorian Prime, and the arguments had grown heated with Lord Brennan leading the opposition, and he claimed that humans were too young as a species, and too violent and too unpredictable to be trusted with knowledge of the Valorian civilization. But Arya had cast the deciding vote in favor of contact, because she believed isolation would eventually lead to conflict, and perhaps even war. Shadow. Her larger dragon circled overhead, and his massive wings created gusts of wind that rattled the crystalline chimes hanging from the tower, and through their mental bond, Arya felt his curiosity mixed with caution. And Shadow had lived for 400 cycles, and he remembered the wars with the Krellian Empire, and the near extinction of the dragon species, and he did not trust easily. The transport ship landed in the ceremonial plaza below, and a ramp extended from its side, and Arya watched as the first human stepped onto Valorian soil, and he was tall for his species with dark hair and broad shoulders, and he wore a simple blue uniform without the elaborate decorations that Valorian officers favored, and his name was Kyle Martinez, and he was the human ambassador chosen to establish first contact. Kyle looked around the plaza with obvious wonder, and his eyes took in the floating gardens and the crystalline architecture and the dozens of dragons perched on nearby buildings, and Arya saw him pause when he noticed Shadow circling above, and even from this distance she could see the smile that crossed his face. The Valorian greeting committee approached Kyle, and they were led by Lord Brennan, who made no effort to hide his displeasure, and the Lord wore traditional robes of silver and gold, and his pointed ears were adorned with rings that marked his status and his dragon. A green-scaled creature named Vortex stood behind him with smoke curling from his nostrils. Arya decided she had seen enough from a distance, and she signaled to Ember, and together they descended from the tower using the spiral ramps that wound through the palace, and Shadow followed them and landed in the plaza, just as the greeting committee finished their formal introductions. Kyle turned at the sound of Shadow's landing, and his hand moved instinctively toward the weapon at his belt, but he stopped himself and instead stood still as the massive dragon approached, and Shadow lowered his head and sniffed the human carefully, and Arya held her breath because she knew that Shadow's judgment would influence how the other dragons viewed humans. After a long moment, Shadow pulled back and rumbled deep in his chest, and it was not a threatening sound, but rather one of acceptance, and Arya felt relief flood through her, and she stepped forward with Ember at her side. Kyle bowed in the human style and said, "It is an honor to meet you, Princess Arya, and your companions are magnificent." Arya returned the bow and replied, "Welcome to Valorian Prime, Kyle Martinez, and I hope your stay will be enlightening for both our peoples." Lord Brennan interrupted, and his voice was cold as he said, "The human will be housed in the guest quarters, and his movements will be restricted to approved areas, and we cannot risk security breaches." Kyle nodded, but Arya saw the flash of disappointment in his eyes, and she said, "Lord Brennan, I will personally show our guest around the palace and ensure he understands our customs, and my dragons will accompany us for safety." The Lord could not argue with a direct statement from the princess, and he bowed stiffly and left with Vortex following behind, and the other members of the greeting committee dispersed, and soon only Arya and Kyle remained in the plaza with Ember, and Shadow. Kyle looked at Arya and said, "Thank you for that, and I get the feeling not everyone here is happy about humans visiting." Arya gestured for him to walk with her, and she said, "You are correct, and many of my people fear what they do not understand, and humans have a reputation for being aggressive and unpredictable." Kyle laughed and said, "Well, we can be both of those things, but we are also curious and adaptable and capable of great compassion." They walked through the palace gardens, and Arya pointed out various plants and explained their uses, and Kyle listened attentively and asked intelligent questions, and Arya found herself enjoying his company more than she expected, and there was a directness to humans that she found refreshing after centuries of Valorian formality. Ember trotted alongside them and occasionally nudged Kyle with her snout, and the human reached out tentatively and stroked her scales, and Ember chirped happily, and Arya said she likes you, and that is rare for dragons, and they are usually wary of strangers. Kyle smiled and said, I have always loved animals, and on Earth I grew up on a farm, and we had horses and dogs and even a few rescue eagles. Shadow landed ahead of them and blocked the path, and Kyle stopped and waited, patiently, and the dragon stared at the human with golden eyes, and Arya felt Shadow probing with his mind and testing Kyle's thoughts and emotions. After a moment, Shadow stepped aside and sent Arya a mental image, and it was an impression of honesty and courage and also sadness. And Arya understood that Kyle carried burdens from his past. They continued their tour, and Arya showed Kyle the Hall of Ancestors, where holographic displays told the history of the Valorian people, and Kyle was fascinated by the story of how the elves and dragons formed their bond thousands of cycles ago. He said, this bond you share with dragons is incredible, and humans have legends of dragons, but we never thought they were real. Arya explained that the bond formed when a Valorian and a dragon chose each other, and it was a mental and emotional connection that lasted for life, and the bond allowed them to share thoughts and feelings, and even pain. Kyle asked, do all Valorians bond with dragons? Arya shook her head and said no, and only about 1 in 10 of my people have the mental capacity for a true bond, and I was fortunate to bond with both Ember and Shadow at different times in my life. Kyle looked thoughtful and said that must be an incredible responsibility. Arya agreed and said it is, but it is also a gift beyond measure. They reached the library tower, and Arya showed Kyle the vast collection of knowledge stored in crystal matrices, and Kyle was amazed by the technology, and he asked many questions about how the crystals worked, and Arya answered as best she could, though some technologies were restricted. As the first sun began to set, Kyle said, I have a confession to make, and the real reason I volunteered for this mission was because I believe humans and Valorians need each other. Arya stopped and looked at him and said, what do you mean? Kyle said, the galaxy is vast and dangerous, and both our species face threats we cannot handle alone, and the Krellian Empire grows stronger every cycle. And there are rumors of other hostile civilizations beyond known space, and if we remain divided, we will be conquered separately. Arya had thought similar things, but hearing a human voice them made the reality more immediate, and she said the Council would never agree to an alliance, and they believe we are strong enough alone. Kyle said with respect, Princess, your people have not faced a real threat in over 200 cycles, and you have grown comfortable, and humans may be young and rough around the edges, but we know how to fight and how to adapt and how to survive against impossible odds. Arya felt a mix of annoyance and admiration, and she said, you are bold to speak so plainly to a princess. Kyle smiled and said, you asked for honesty, and I am giving it to you. They stood in silence for a moment, and then Arya said, I will consider your words. Kyle Martinez, and perhaps there is wisdom in what you say. As darkness fell, Arya led Kyle to the guest quarters, and she said, tomorrow I will introduce you to more of our culture, and you will meet other members of the royal family. Kyle bowed and said, I look forward to it, and thank you again for your kindness today. After Kyle entered his quarters, Arya stood outside with her dragons, and Shadow sent her a mental question, and he wanted to know if she trusted the human. Arya thought carefully before answering, and she said, I do not know yet. But there is something about him that feels different, and maybe the humans are not what we expected. Ember chirped and sent an image of Kyle stroking her scales and the feeling of warmth and gentleness that came with it, and Shadow rumbled in agreement. Arya returned to her chambers, and she looked out over the city as lights began to glow from thousands of buildings, and she thought about Kyle's words about alliance and unity, and she wondered if her people were truly as strong as they believed, or if they were simply hiding from a changing galaxy. That night, Arya dreamed of fire and ships falling from the sky, and when she woke, she knew that the arrival of Kyle Martinez was just the beginning of something much larger. The morning suns rose over Valorian Prime and cast golden light through the crystal windows of the palace, and Kyle woke in his quarters feeling both excited and nervous about his second day on this alien world, and he dressed in clean clothes from his pack and stepped outside to find Princess Arya already waiting with Ember at her side. Arya smiled and said, I hope you slept well, and today I want to show you something special. Kyle followed her through corridors filled with flowing water, features and plants that glowed softly in the shadows, and they descended several levels until they reached a massive chamber carved from natural rock. And inside the chamber, dozens of dragon eggs rested in nests of precious metals and gems. Arya explained that this was the hatching chamber, and every Valorian dragon was born here, and the eggs required specific temperatures and energy frequencies to develop properly. And she pointed to one egg that was beginning to crack and said, This one will hatch within the next few solar cycles. Kyle approached the egg carefully, and he could see movement beneath the shell, and he said, This is incredible. And how long does it take for an egg to hatch? Arya said it varies, but usually between 2 and 3 cycles of our world. And when the dragon emerges, it is already able to bond with a Valorian, if both parties are willing. Kyle watched the egg with fascination, and then he noticed that some nests were empty, and he asked what happened to those eggs. Arya's expression grew sad, and she said, Not all eggs survive, and sometimes they simply fail to develop, and other times they are taken by those who would use dragons for dark purposes. Kyle frowned and said, Someone steals dragon eggs. Arya nodded and said there is a black market throughout the galaxy for dragon eggs, and the Krellian Empire in particular has tried for decades to create their own dragon riders. But without the natural bond our people share with dragons, their efforts always fail and the dragons become violent and uncontrollable. Kyle said that is horrible. And what security measures do you have in place? Arya gestured around the chamber and said, The hatching chamber is protected by both technology and magic, and only members of the royal family and bonded dragon riders can enter without triggering alarms, but we have had close calls in the past. They left the hatching chamber and continued their tour, and Arya took Kyle to the training grounds where young Valorians practiced aerial combat with their dragons, and Kyle watched in awe as riders and dragons moved together in perfect synchronization and performing loops and dives that seemed to defy physics. One young rider named Kara landed nearby, and her dragon was smaller than Ember but quick and agile, and Kara dismounted and approached with curiosity in her eyes, and she said, So you are the human everyone is talking about? Kyle smiled and said, I suppose I am, and your flying is impressive. Kara grinned and said, Would you like to try? Kyle looked surprised and said, I do not think your dragon would allow me to ride. Kara laughed and said, Not my dragon, but perhaps one of the training saddles, and we use them to help young children get used to flight before they bond with their own dragons. Arya said, Kara, that may not be appropriate, but Kyle said, I would love to try if you do not mind. Princess Arya hesitated and then nodded, and she called Shadow down from where he had been circling overhead, and Shadow landed and lowered himself to allow Kyle to climb onto his back. Kyle settled into the riding harness and gripped the handles tightly, and Shadow turned his head to look at the human with one golden eye. And Arya felt through their bond that Shadow was amused. She said, Hold on and do not panic no matter what happens. Shadow launched into the air, and Kyle let out a shout that was part fear and part exhilaration, and the dragon climbed steeply and then leveled off above the palace, and Kyle slowly relaxed his grip and began to look around. From this height, the entire city spread out below them, and Kyle could see the geometric patterns of streets and buildings and the green spaces of parks and gardens, and in the distance, the ocean sparkled under the 3 suns. Shadow sent Arya a mental message, and he said, The human has courage, and he does not freeze with fear, like most who fly for the first time. Arya watched from below as Shadow took Kyle on a circuit around the palace, and the dragon kept the flight smooth and steady. And when they finally landed, Kyle climbed down with a huge smile on his face. He said, That was the most amazing experience of my life. And thank you, Shadow. The dragon rumbled in approval, and Arya felt surprised because Shadow rarely showed approval to anyone outside the royal family. Kara said, You did well, human, and most people throw up on their first flight. Kyle laughed and said, I came close, but I managed to keep it together. We returned to the palace for the midday meal, and Arya introduced Kyle to her mother, Queen Lyssa, who ruled Valorian Prime with wisdom and strength, and the queen studied Kyle carefully as they ate. Queen Lyssa asked, So, Kyle Martinez, what do humans seek from contact with the Valorian people? Kyle put down his fork and said with respect, "Your Majesty, we seek knowledge and friendship, and an end to isolation and humanity has spread across dozens of worlds, but we know we are not alone in the galaxy, and we would rather meet our neighbors with open hands than clenched fists." The Queen said pretty words, but words are easy, and actions reveal true intentions. Kyle nodded and said, "You are right, and that is why I propose." A testaria leaned forward and said, "What kind of test?" Kyle said, "Let me prove that humans can be valuable allies and give me a problem or challenge that your people face, and let me attempt to solve it using human methods. And if I fail, then you will have evidence that we are not ready for deeper contact." Queen Lissa exchanged glances with Arya, and then said, "Very well, and there is a situation that has troubled us for some time, and in the southern continent, there is a colony of Valorians who have refused to acknowledge royal authority, and they have cut off all communication, and we do not know if they are in danger or if they have simply chosen independence." Kyle said, "And you want me to make contact with them?" The Queen said, "If you can, and we have sent emissaries, but they were turned away, and we have considered using military force, but that could lead to civil conflict." Kyle thought for a moment and said, "I will need transportation and maybe 1 or 2 Valorian volunteers who are willing to try a different approach." Arya said, "I will go with you, and Ember and Shadow can provide protection." Queen Lissa looked concerned and said, "Arya, you are the crown princess, and this could be dangerous." Arya met her mother's eyes and said, "That is exactly why I should go, and if we are to build trust with humans, then I must show that I believe in them." The Queen sighed and said, "Very well, but you will take a full security detail." Arya agreed, though she suspected Kyle would have preferred a smaller group. They spent the rest of the day preparing for the journey, and Kyle met with the security team and explained his plan. And he said, "We will not approach as conquerors or authorities, but as guests seeking understanding, and we will bring gifts and offer help rather than demands." The security captain, a stern Valorian named Darius, said, "And if they attack us," Kyle said, "then we defend ourselves, but we do not initiate conflict." The next morning they departed in a small transport ship, and Arya piloted, while Kyle sat beside her and studied maps of the southern continent, and Ember and Shadow flew alongside the ship, and their wings caught the light of the rising suns. As they flew south, the landscape changed from cities and farmland to dense forests, and then to rocky mountains, and Kyle said, "Your world is beautiful." Arya said, "It is the only home I have ever known, and I sometimes wonder what other worlds are." Like Kyle said, Earth has oceans that cover most of the planet, and mountains that touch the clouds, and deserts where it never rains, and cities with billions of people all living together, and it is chaotic and loud and wonderful. Arya smiled and said, "Perhaps one day I will visit." They reached the southern continent by midday, and Arya guided the ship toward the coordinates of the rebel colony. And as they approached, they saw a small settlement built into the side of a mountain, and defensive barriers surrounded the colony, and several weapons platforms tracked their ship. Arya opened a communication channel and said, "This is Princess Arya of the royal family, and we come in peace to speak with the leaders of your colony." There was a long silence, and then a voice responded and said, "We want no contact with the royal family, and you have ignored our needs for too long, and leave now, or we will fire." Kyle leaned toward the microphone and said, "My name is Kyle Martinez, and I am a human from Earth, and I am not part of your political disputes, and I would like to speak with you as one independent person to another." Another silence, and then the voice said, "A human, and why would a human care about our problems?" Kyle said, "Because I know what it is like to feel unheard and to believe that those in power do not understand your struggles, and maybe I can help or maybe I cannot, but either way I would like to try." The weapons platforms lowered slightly, and the voice said, "You may land, but only you and the princess and your dragons must remain outside." They landed the ship, and Kyle and Arya disembarked and approached the colony entrance on foot, and the gates opened, and a group of Valorians emerged, and they looked tired and worn, and their clothes were practical rather than decorative. The leader was a woman named Helena, and she had gray hair and sharp eyes, and she said, "So the crown princess finally visits, and what brings you to our forgotten corner of the world?" The return journey to the capital was quiet, and Arya spent most of the flight thinking about what had happened in the southern colony. And Kyle had shown her a different way of approaching problems, and one based on empathy rather than authority. and she wondered how many other colonies felt abandoned by the royal family. When they landed at the palace, Lord Brennan was waiting, and his face was dark with anger, and he said, "Princess Arya, I have heard reports that you authorized an emergency shipment of energy crystals to the rebel colony. Without council approval, Arya dismounted from the ship and faced him calmly, and she said, I did, and the colony was in desperate need, and it was the right thing to do." Lord Brennan said, "You overstepped. Your authority and the council will hear of this, and there will be consequences." Kyle stepped forward and said, "If I may speak, Lord Brennan and the colony agreed to reopen communications in exchange for the aid, and that seems like a positive outcome, Lord." Brennan turned his cold gaze on Kyle and said, "You have been on our world for mere solar cycles, and you presume to understand our politics, and humans are guests here, and nothing more." Kyle did not back down, and he said, "I understand that people in need should be helped regardless of politics." The Lord said, "You understand nothing, and you are here because the princess has a naive fascination with your primitive species, and the council will put an end to this experiment soon enough." Arya felt her temper flare, and she said, "Lord Brennan, you will not speak to our guest that way, and Kyle has done more in 2 days to heal divisions in our society than the council has done in 10 cycles." The Lord looked shocked that Arya would challenge him so directly, and he said, "We will see what the queen has to say about this," and he turned and strode away with his dragon. Vortex following, Kyle let out a breath and said, "I am sorry if I have made things difficult for you." Arya shook her head and said, "You showed me that I have been too comfortable following rules that do not always serve my people, and that is valuable even if it causes trouble." They walked through the palace gardens, and Ember and Shadow followed at a distance, and Kyle said, "What will happen now?" Arya said, "The council will demand a formal hearing and they will question my decision, and depending on how the debate goes, I could face censure or even temporary removal from the succession." Kyle stopped walking and said, "I did not realize the stakes were so high, and maybe I should speak to the council and take responsibility." Arya smiled and said, "That is kind, but this is my choice, and I stand by it." They sat on a bench beside a fountain and watched the water create rainbow patterns in the light, and Kyle said, "On Earth we have a saying, and it is that the true measure of a society is how it treats its most vulnerable members." Arya said, "That is wise, and I think my people have forgotten that wisdom." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. And then Arya said, "Tell me more about Earth, and what is your family like?" Kyle looked down at his hands and said, "My parents died when I was young, and they were colonists on a frontier world, and there was an accident at the terraforming station, and I was raised by my uncle who was a shuttle pilot." Arya felt a pang of sympathy, and she said, "I am sorry for your loss." Kyle shrugged and said, "It was a long time ago, but it taught me that life is fragile, and we should not waste time on pride or stubbornness when we could be helping each other." Arya understood now why Shadow had sensed sadness in Kyle, and she said, "You carry your loss." "Well," Kyle said, "I try, and my parents believed in exploration and in bringing different people together, and becoming an ambassador felt like honoring their memory." Before Arya could respond, a messenger arrived and said, "Princess Arya, the Queen requests your presence in the council." Chamber Arya stood and said, "It seems the hearing will be sooner than I expected." Kyle said, "Do you want me there?" Arya thought about it and said, "Yes, and you should hear how Valorian governance works, and for better or worse." They entered the council chamber, and it was a circular room with high ceilings and walls covered in holographic star maps, and the council members sat in elevated seats arranged in a semicircle, and Queen Lyssa occupied the central throne. Lord Brennan stood in the center of the chamber, and he said, "Honored council, we are here to address the princess unauthorized action in providing aid to the rebel colony." Queen Lyssa looked at Arya and said, "Daughter, do you acknowledge that you acted without council approval?" Arya stepped forward and said, "I do acknowledge it, Mother, and I believed the situation required immediate action." Lord Brennan said, "The princess has set a dangerous precedent, and if we allow rebels to receive aid simply by refusing to communicate, then others will follow their example, and our entire system of governance could collapse." An older council member named Lady Vera said, "Lord Brennan makes a valid point, but we must also consider that the southern colony has legitimate grievances, and perhaps we have been too slow to respond to their needs." Lord Brennan said, "Their grievances do not justify rebellion. Arya said with respect they stopped rebelling when someone finally listened to them, and Kyle showed me that sometimes we need to set aside our pride and simply help those who are suffering. Lord Brennan sneered and said, and we should take advice from a human and a species that has barely left its own solar system. Kyle stepped forward and he bowed to the council and said, "Honored members, I do not claim to understand all the complexities of your society, but I have traveled to many human colonies and I have seen what happens when governments stop listening to their people, and it always ends in violence and division and suffering." A council member named Lord Tarn said, "And what would you have us do?" Human Kyle said, "Treat your colonies as partners rather than subjects and listen to their concerns and respond with compassion rather than authority. And you might be surprised how many problems can be solved through dialogue." Lord Brennan said, "Pretty speech, but meaningless, and the human has no understanding of Dragon Bond society or our traditions." Queen Lissa raised her hand for silence and she said, "I have heard enough arguments, and Princess Arya, your action was technically a violation of protocol, but your intention was sound and therefore I will not censure you. But I do require that future emergency aid decisions be brought to the council when possible." Arya bowed and said, "Thank you." Mother Lord Brennan looked furious, but he said, "Nothing." The Queen continued and said, "Furthermore, I am establishing a new position on the council and an ambassador for colony relations and Princess Arya. You will fill this role and you will travel to our colonies and assess their needs and report back to us." Arya was surprised but pleased and she said, "I accept this responsibility." The Queen looked at Kyle and said, "And Kyle Martinez, I would like you to accompany the princess as an advisor, and your outside perspective may help us see issues we have been blind to." Kyle bowed and said, "I am honored, Your Majesty." Lord Brennan could not contain himself, and he said, "This is outrageous and we are giving authority to a human." The Queen said, "We are accepting help from someone who has already proven his value, and the matter is settled and council dismissed." The members filed out and Lord Brennan shot angry glances at both Arya and Kyle as he left. When they were alone, Kyle said, "Well, that went better than I expected." Arya laughed and said, "My mother is wise, and she saw an opportunity to address a real problem while also giving me more responsibility." Kyle said, "So we are going to travel to the colonies together?" Arya nodded and said, "It seems so, and I hope you are prepared for a lot of flying." That evening, Arya took Kyle to the Royal Observatory where massive telescopes watched distant stars, and she pointed out various constellations and explained their significance in Valorian culture. Kyle pointed to a cluster of stars and said, "That is the direction of Earth and about 40 light years from here." Arya said, "It seems both close and impossibly far." Kyle said, "Distance is relative, and what matters is connection, and I feel more connected to you and your people after a few days than I do to some humans I have known for years." Arya felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, and she said, "I feel the same, and you have challenged me to be better and to think differently." They stood side by side, looking at the stars and Ember, curled up at their feet while Shadow perched on the observatory dome above them. Kyle said, "Arya, can I ask you something personal?" She nodded and said, "Of course." He said, "Do you ever feel trapped by your role as princess and by all the expectations and protocols?" Arya was quiet for a moment and then said, "Yes. And sometimes I wonder what my life would be like if I were just a normal Valorian and free to make my own choices without worrying about political consequences." Kyle said, "I think you would still be exactly who you are, and kind and brave and determined to help others, and those qualities do not come from your title." Arya looked at him and saw sincerity in his eyes, and she said, "Thank you, Kyle. And that means more than you know." A shooting star streaked across the sky, and Kyle said, "On Earth we have a tradition, and when you see a shooting star you make a wish." Arya smiled and said, "And what do you wish for?" Kyle said, "I wish for our peoples to find a way forward together and to build something stronger than either of us could achieve alone." Arya said, "That is a good wish, and I share it." They remained at the observatory until the suns began to rise and painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and as they walked back to the palace, Arya realized that something fundamental had shifted in her life, and Kyle had arrived as a stranger and an outsider, but he was quickly becoming something more important, and she was not sure if. 3 solar cycles passed as Arya and Kyle planned their journey to the colonies, and they studied reports and maps and identified 7 settlements that had reported problems or grievances with the central government, and Kyle suggested they visit the most distant colony first to demonstrate commitment. On the morning of their departure, Arya wore practical traveling clothes instead of her royal robes, and she carried minimal luggage because Shadow and Ember would be flying alongside their transport ship, and Kyle packed light as well, though he brought several gifts from Earth, including seeds for crops that might grow in different climates. Queen Lysa met them at the departure platform, and she embraced Arya and said, "Be safe, my daughter, and remember that you represent not just our family but all of Valorian Primaria. Said I will make you proud, mother." The queen turned to Kyle and said, "Protect her, human, and I am trusting you with something more precious than you can imagine." Kyle bowed deeply and said, "I will guard her with my life, your majesty." They boarded the ship, and Arya took the pilot's seat while Kyle handled navigation, and as they lifted off, Shadow and Ember launched into the air, and their wings caught the morning light. The first colony was located on a moon orbiting a gas giant, and it took 2 full days of travel to reach it. And during the journey, Kyle and Arya talked about many things, and she learned about human history and the wars and struggles that shaped his species. And he learned about Valorian philosophy and the ancient bond between elves and dragons. Kyle said, "Your people have achieved so much in advanced technology and long lives and a connection with dragons that seems almost magical. And what do you think humans can offer in return?" Arya thought carefully and said, "Humans have something we have lost, and a fire in your spirit and a willingness to take risks and to adapt quickly to change. And we have become comfortable and maybe even stagnant." Kyle smiled and said, "So we are the chaos to your order." Arya laughed and said, "Perhaps, but I think we need both, and too much order becomes rigid and too much chaos becomes destructive." They arrived at the moon colony, and it was called Haven Station, and it had been established 50 cycles ago to mine rare minerals, and the colony was built into a series of connected domes, because the moon had no atmosphere as they landed. Arya noticed that many of the domes showed signs of damage, and cracks in the transparent material had been patched with metal plates, and the mining equipment visible outside looked old and poorly maintained. The colony administrator was a tired-looking Valorian named Marcus, who met them at the airlock, and he said, "Princess Arya, it is an honor, but I must be honest, and we did not expect anyone from the capital to actually visit us." Arya said, "That is exactly why we are here, and the central government has been too distant from the colonies for too long." Marcus led them through the colony, and the interior was cramped and dimly lit, and many residents looked undernourished, and Arya felt ashamed that she had not known how bad conditions were. Kyle asked, "What is your main challenge here?" Marcus sighed and said, "Everything, and our life support systems are failing, and the mining equipment breaks down constantly, and we cannot grow enough food in our hydroponics bays because the lighting systems are inadequate, and we have requested aid for years, but always the response is that other colonies have priority." Arya said, "I apologize for the failure of my government, and that ends now. And what do you need most urgently?" Marcus looked surprised by the directness, and he said, "Honestly, Princess, we need engineers to repair our systems, and we need replacement parts, and we need better hydroponics equipment, but most of all, we need to know that someone cares whether we live or die." Kyle pulled out a data pad, and he said, "I am going to document everything you need. And when we return to Valorian Prime, I will personally ensure that supplies are shipped here within 1 solar cycle." Marcus said, "You would do that?" Kyle said, "I would, and your people are working under impossible conditions, and that is not acceptable." They spent the day touring the colony and talking to residents, and Arya listened to their stories, and many had come to Haven Station full of hope decades ago, but that hope had slowly died as they were forgotten by the Capital One. Young woman named Lisa showed them the schools where children learned in crowded rooms with outdated equipment, and she said, "We try to give them a good education, but it is hard when we lack basic resources." Arya knelt down to speak with the children, and she asked them what they wanted to be when they grew up, and one small boy said, "I want to be a dragon rider like you, Princess Arias." Heart broke a little, and she said, "Then you should come visit the capital and see the dragons, and I will arrange for scholarships for any children from the colonies who want to attend the Royal Academy." Lisa's eyes filled with tears, and she said, "Truly." Arya nodded and said, "Every child deserves the chance to pursue their dreams, regardless of where they were born." That evening, Marcus hosted a dinner for Arya and Kyle, and despite limited resources, the colonists prepared a feast and they shared stories and songs, and Kyle noticed how tight-knit the community was, and how they supported each other through hardship after dinner. Kyle said, "You have something special here and a real sense of community, and many wealthy colonies lack that." Marcus said, "Hardship either tears people apart or binds them together, and we chose to stay together before they left the next morning." Arya addressed all the colonists in the main dome, and she said, "I came here expecting to deliver aid and to solve problems, but what I found was a community of strong, capable people who have survived despite being abandoned. And I am humbled by your resilience, and I promise you that this will never happen again, and you will have the support you deserve." The colonists applauded, and many had tears in their eyes. And as Arya and Kyle returned to their ship, Marcus gripped Kyle's hand and said, "Thank you for bringing her here, and for reminding us that someone in the capital still has a heart." The second colony was on a planet with dense jungles and extreme weather, and it was called Greenreach, and the colonists there struggled with local predators that attacked their settlements and destroyed crops. The colony leader was a fierce woman named Dana, who carried scars from predator attacks, and she said, "We have asked for defense systems and for weapons, but the council says, we chose to settle here, and we must deal with the consequences." Kyle examined the situation, and he said, "The predators are just trying to survive like you are, and maybe there is a way to coexist." Dana looked skeptical and said, "Coexist with creatures that have killed 12 of my people?" Kyle said, "On Earth we had similar problems with large predators, and we learned that they usually attack because we encroach on their territory or disrupt their food sources. And what if we modify your settlement boundaries and create buffer zones?" Arya said that could work, and we could also install sonic barriers that would discourage predators without harming them. Dana thought about it and said, "I suppose we could try, and anything is better than watching more people die." Kyle worked with the colonists to design new defensive perimeters, and he showed them Earth techniques for managing wildlife, and Arya used her authority to order immediate shipment of sonic barrier equipment. On the third night at Greenreach, something unexpected happened, and a large predator approached the settlement, but instead of attacking, it stopped at the new boundary and sniffed the air and then turned away. Dana watched from the walls, and she said, "By the ancestors," and it worked. Kyle smiled and said, "Sometimes the best solutions are the ones that let everyone survive." They visited 5 more colonies over the following weeks, and each had unique challenges, and each taught Arya something new about leadership and about the real cost of distant governance. At a mining colony called Deepshaft, they found workers suffering from respiratory problems because safety equipment was outdated, and Kyle helped them design better ventilation systems using simple earth technology. At an agricultural colony called Harvest Fields, they found farmers struggling with soil depletion, and Arya arranged for scientists from the capital to visit and share advanced farming techniques. At a research outpost called Farsight, they found brilliant scientists working with equipment so old it barely functioned, and Kyle secured funding from human corporations interested in joint research projects. With each colony visit, Arya saw Kyle work tirelessly, and he listened to people, and he treated everyone with respect regardless of their status, and he found creative solutions that combined human ingenuity with Valorian resources. One evening, as they camped between colonies, Kyle sat by a fire and looked exhausted, and Arya sat beside him and said, "You are pushing yourself too hard." Kyle said, "These people have been suffering for years, and if I can help ease that suffering even a little, then the exhaustion is worth it." Arya said, "You have a good heart, Kyle Martinez." He looked at her and said, "You do too, and I have watched you genuinely connect with every person we have met, and you remember their names and their stories, and you care about their lives, and that is rare in leaders." Arya felt her face warm, and she said, "I learned from watching you." They sat in comfortable silence, and Shadow and Ember slept nearby, and the fire crackled and sent sparks into the night sky. Kyle said, "Arya, can I tell you something?" She nodded and said, "Always." Kyle bowed respectfully to Elder Crane and said, "I do not presume to lecture anyone, and I am simply sharing observations from someone who has seen both tradition and progress work together successfully." Elder Crane crossed his arms and said, "Tradition and progress are enemies, and one destroys the other." Arya stepped forward and said with respect, "Elder, I disagree, and my bond with Ember and Shadow is an ancient tradition, and yet I use modern technology to care for them and to keep them healthy. And the tradition remains strong because I adapted how I practice it. The elder looked thoughtful but said nothing, and he gestured for them to follow him into the colony. First landing was beautiful, and the buildings were constructed in the old style, with carved stone and living wood that grew into graceful shapes, and gardens filled with traditional plants covered every available space, and residents wore classical robes and moved with formal dignity. Elder Crane showed them the Hall of Memories, where holographic displays preserved the history of the first settlers, and Kyle watched with genuine interest as the displays showed brave Valorians establishing the colony against enormous odds. He said, "This is remarkable, and your ancestors were incredibly courageous." Elder Crane softened slightly and said they were, and they left Valorian Prime to escape a war that threatened to destroy our homeworld, and they came here with nothing but hope and determination, and they built all of this area, said, and their legacy deserves to be honored. Elder Crane said, "Yet the capital wants us to abandon their ways and to become like every other modern colony." Kyle said, "What specifically does the capital want you to change?" The elder said, "They want us to replace our traditional agriculture with automated systems, and they want us to tear down our old buildings and construct modern facilities, and they want our children to attend virtual schools instead of learning from village elders." Arya looked shocked, and she said, "Elder Crane, I was not aware of these demands, and who issued them?" Elder Crane pulled out official documents and showed them to Arya, and they bore Lord Brennan's seal, and the documents outlined a modernization plan that would essentially erase First Landing's unique culture. Arya felt anger rise in her chest, and she said, "These orders were issued without my knowledge or my mother's, and Lord Brennan has overstepped his authority." Kyle examined the documents and said, "These demands are unreasonable, and there is no justification for forcing cultural change on a thriving community." Elder Crane looked between them and said, "So, you did not come here to enforce these demands?" Arya shook her head firmly and said, "Absolutely not. And in fact, I am going to ensure these orders are revoked." The elder studied her face and then nodded slowly, and he said, "Perhaps I judged too quickly, and please forgive my coldness." Arya smiled and said, "There is nothing to forgive, and you were protecting your people, and that is admirable." Elder Crane invited them to stay for the evening celebration, and First Landing was preparing for the Festival of Founding, which commemorated the original settlement. And as the sun set, the colonists gathered in the central square. Torches were lit, and musicians played traditional instruments, and the sound was hauntingly beautiful. And dancers performed ancient steps that told stories of the journey from Valorian Prime. And Kyle watched in fascination. Elder Crane sat beside Arya and Kyle on the observation platform, and he said, "We practice these traditions to remember who we are, and without them we would be lost." Kyle said, "I understand that, and on Earth many cultures struggled when they lost connection to their traditions, and the key is finding balance between honoring the past and embracing the future." Arya said, "Elder Crane, what if I proposed a compromise, and what if First Landing became a cultural preservation site, and you would maintain your traditional ways and teach them to others, but you would also share your knowledge with other colonies, and you could show them that tradition and progress can coexist?" The elder considered this and said, "We would become teachers." Arya nodded and said, "Your colony would be officially recognized as a historical and cultural center, and students from across our territories would come here to learn, and you would receive funding to maintain your buildings and practices, but you would also have access to modern medicine and safety systems that do not interfere with your way of life." Elder Crane said, "That is a wise proposal, and it gives us purpose beyond mere survival," Kyle said, "and it ensures that future generations of Valorians will understand their heritage." The elder stood and addressed the gathered colonists, and he explained Arya's proposal, and the people discussed it among themselves. And finally they voted to accept. Elder Crane turned to Arya and said, "Princess, you have given us hope, and we thought the capital had forgotten our value, but you have shown us that we matter." Arya felt tears in her eyes, and she said, "You have always mattered, and I am sorry it took so long for someone to recognize it." The celebration continued late into the night, And Kyle was invited to try the traditional dances, and he was clumsy at first, but the colonists laughed good-naturedly and helped him learn the steps. And Arya watched him with warmth in her heart shadow, and Ember joined the celebration, in their own way. And they performed aerial displays above the square, and the colonists watched in awe as the dragons looped and soared and breathed controlled bursts of flame that created patterns in the sky. Later that night, Arya and Kyle walked through the quiet gardens, and most of the colonists had gone to sleep and only a few torches still burned. Kyle said, "This has been an incredible journey, and every colony taught me something new." Arya said, "You have changed me, Kyle, and before you arrived, I thought I understood my duty. But you showed me that duty is not just following rules, and it is about genuinely caring for people and listening to them and fighting for their needs." Kyle stopped walking and turned to face her, and he said, "Arya, when I return to Earth, I'm going to recommend that humanity establish a formal alliance with Valorian Prime Area." Felt a chill despite the warm night, and she said, "When you return to Earth, and I knew this moment would come, but I am not ready for it." Kyle took her hands and said, "I do not want to leave, and everything I care about is here, and you are here. But my mission was temporary, and eventually my government will want me to report back." Arya said, "What if you stayed, and what if you became a permanent ambassador, and you could live on Valorian Prime and continue helping the colonies?" Kyle looked hopeful and said, "Would your people accept that?" Arya said, "I would make them accept it, and you have proven your value. And even those who were skeptical at first have come to respect you." Kyle pulled her close and said, "Then I will stay, and I cannot imagine being anywhere else." They stood in the garden holding each other, and above them Shadow and Ember circled, and their mental presence was warm and approving. Arya sent a message through her bond, and she asked Shadow if he thought she was making the right choice. Shadow responded with an image, and it showed the future spreading out before them like a vast sky, and there were challenges ahead, but also joy and purpose and partnership. Ember sent feelings of pure happiness and excitement. Kyle said, "What are your dragons saying?" Arya smiled and said, "They approve, and that is the highest endorsement possible." They remained in the gardens until dawn began to break, and then they returned to their ship and began the journey back to Valorian Prime. During the long flight home, Arya compiled reports on all 7 colonies, and she documented their needs and their successes and their potential. And Kyle helped her draft recommendations for the council. He said you should propose a permanent colony liaison program, and each colony should have a direct representative in the capital who can advocate for their needs. Arya agreed and said, "And we should establish regular visits so that members of the royal family and council members actually see the colonies, instead of just reading reports." Kyle said these changes will face resistance. Arya said, "I know, but I have seen too much to go back to how things were. And Lord Brennan and others like him will try to block reforms, but they will not succeed." When they arrived at Valorian Prime, Queen Lyssa met them personally, and her face was serious, and she said, "Daughter, we need to talk privately." Arya and Kyle exchanged concerned glances, and they followed the queen to her private chambers. Queen Lyssa said, "I have received daily reports about your colony visits, and you have made quite an impact, and you have also made enemies." Arya said, "Lord Brennan." The queen nodded and said, "He has been gathering support among the conservative council members, and he claims you are undermining traditional authority, and that you are too influenced by the human Kyle." Said, "Your Majesty, if I have caused problems, I can leave." Queen Lyssa held up her hand and said, "You misunderstand human, and I am not criticizing, and in fact I am proud of what my daughter has accomplished. And the question is, what happens next?" Arya said, "I want to implement permanent reforms, and I want to create systems that prevent colonies from being neglected." The queen said, "That will require significant political capital, and are you prepared for the fight?" Arya straightened her shoulders and said, "Yes, mother, and I am ready." Queen Lyssa smiled and said, "Good. And because I am supporting you fully, and tomorrow we will call an emergency council session, and we will present your findings and force a vote on colony reforms." Kyle said, "Your Majesty, why are you willing to take this political risk?"